just normal LP rewards, even as more LPs come in later and volume goes up and all of that, you're not being diluted in terms of those like farming token rewards. So it'll essentially allow us to give early LPs a kind of consistent reward and stake in that instance of the protocol for providing early liquidity, and then also still kind of have this cross-chain network effect with Honey. And we're working with Connext to create like a state channel network between chains. So we'll be able to do atomic swaps as part of the trading process. So you go to the Honey Swap interface on XDAI and you go and make a trade. You may actually have a more complicated trade that does an atomic swap over to Matic, makes a trade, returns, and comes back because fees are low, but liquidity is fractured. So we can create like a liquidity network across multiple layer 2s and make rebalancing of liquidity across these chains something that like happens in bulk that routers do periodically, as opposed to individual users kind of going over these like slow, expensive bridges through Ethereum.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so that's pretty exciting. How are you, Zargam?
Okay, I'm right now finally succeeding in interacting with data pulled directly from the graph in a Jupyter notebook. I'm currently looking at balancer data because Marcus is the one who gave me the code, but this has been driving me nuts. Like, there's so much data in the graph, and it's set up for people to build apps, but it's not set up for data scientists, and it's so much data. And like, finally, like, I mean, I'm talking. Actually, like, I've been talking to the graph team about this too, and they like gave me their stuff, but they have this Python stuff that's specific to their own subgraphs. So like I have this like deeply like effective mission control queries that are Python based so that their data scientists can analyze the graph, but it's super specific to their own subgraphs. So I'm like, generic query language, generic query like API, please. But anyway.
I think Sean had an example from like one of the last calls where he had like a pretty smooth connection to the graph set up in a Jupyter cadCAD notebook.
I've got one now too, because Marcus gave it to me, and I knew I had asked Sean to look at this, but now I just want to like synthesize. Like, But what I'm doing right now is taking the code that Marcus sent me. I'm just like sticking it in a little notebook with a visual of the liquidity distribution of balancer pools, so that whatchamacallit, what was I gonna say? So that I can stick it in a snippet. Yeah. Well, I want to stick it in a cadCAD like org snippet so other people can find it. But I also, I'm like literally I was listening to you guys and you're talking about liquidity pools, and I'm like hacking on liquidity pool data.
Yeah, I think one of these problems that we're going to face in general is this like both the UX and like the kind of dynamics of not having atomic composability across these like layer 2 either chains or rollups, and trying to figure out how to like minimize that issue as much as possible feels like an important problem to solve for like the next sort of wave of DeFi.
Here's an idea for you. All right, this is gonna be weird. All right, take your LP tokens, so of your Uniswaps and your balancers, all of your main chain LP tokens, bridge them to layer 2, and then put them in like balancer pools of LP tokens. Because ultimately all of the assets, actually the real assets, stayed on the main chain because you are only bridging the claims on them. So you can fuck around with and trade the derivatives on layer 2, but the actual value being accrued is happening on layer 1.
Yeah, we considered that, and you can also do like LP tokens paired with other tokens or other LP tokens for some like weird dynamics. The UX of the token names gets kind of funky, but it's totally makes sense because you're like I do LPing in ETH USDC on mainnet, because it's like pretty consistent right now at like 40% APY, and it is it's basically volatility dampened ETH. So it's like a pretty sweet position.
Yeah. If you followed Rye, because I just like I have so the Rye contracts got deployed like 2 nights ago, and I took out a position. So I opened a CDP on Rye, and then I took the Rye and I put it in an LP position on the Rye Uniswap instance.
Right ETH. Yeah.
Rye ETH. And so I've paid, no joke, $1.50 in borrowing fees, and I've made $200 in LP fees in like 2 days.
That's I'll look into that. I really like the Reflexor Labs approach of kind of governance minimization and self-referential stability. Like if we were gonna do any sort of like honey stable coin type thing, I would definitely like want to use that approach as opposed to do like dollar denomination. It just is like one less piece to break. And the governance minimization stuff is great.
Jeff and
And
I
you can
are
always
we're working on writing an article explaining how the design work for Rye went.
I would love to read that. I was like scouring through their GitHub to see if they open sourced the cadCAD model because I was super fascinated by it.
They will,
but I didn't see it, so I'm assuming that they're just kind of keeping that and probably front end stuff closed for now.
It was a freaking nightmare to explain though, because its thing is that this one key element is that, and this is actually what Marcus and I spent most of our meeting with today talking about, was there's this little slot where there's a thing that doesn't exist but sort of exists in a way. It's a bit like a center of mass. So in all of the modeling, I mean, you know this from your own models where you have to make like assumptions or you have to like simplify something in order for the economics of something like Rye to work in a model. There's this like notion of like the price of debt. It's not really real. It's manifest from everyone's decisions, but it's not the redemption price and it's not the market price. It's this other thing that emerges from people's decisions to open and close CDPs, safes. And so in order to write a model that actually closes the loop, you actually need all three, including the one that doesn't exist. And so you end up playing with these different models of reasoning about how people will value things. And if you look at the real data, at least in the short term, you see a lot of people just taking their ETH for granted. It's basically house money. But from an economics perspective, they're failing to account for the fact that they have real capital at risk that has a opportunity cost as well as like some risk tolerance, like how collateralized your safe is, etc. And so if you look at the way people behave, it manifests like they're ignoring the debt component. They're just like, oh, like I have the ETH and I locked it up, so hey, I got this Rye and now I'm going to do stuff and make money on it or not or whatever. But the valuation is done entirely at the sort of Rye debt against Rye asset and redemption rate stuff. But in practice, that's a really naive short-term way of viewing the system because you really do have ETH and it really is at risk and it really does have an opportunity cost relative to using it for something else. So like on one hand, the data evidences a bunch of sort of naive rationalist arbitrage, but in the long term, that's not really a great strategy because it neglects the systemic risk. So we have models that sort of reflect the debt price accounting for that systemic risk, but then that doesn't generate behavior that's that realistic because people aren't that smart. And so we end up with this weird thing where we're dealing with this, well, the real world is some mixture of people who are initially being pretty dumb, but also doing pretty well for themselves. And then in the long term, there'd be a distribution of different kinds of agents with different kinds of behavior based on any number of things, and the debt price, so to speak, effectively emerges, and it like lives in this three-body problem with the redemption price and the market price. And like now, like if that's what it took months. We're working on this with Jamshid and Marcus and Ben and like lots of people. Andrew, his PhD's work is in monetary economics. Like we have this army of people working on trying to wrap our head around this really hard problem. And so in the end, we have a pretty deep understanding of it. But oh my God, articulating it is so hard. By the way, if we're recording this, I'm probably like complaining. But no, I mean, it's really awesome and fun. But oh my God, is it complicated to try to explain even after all that work.
Super fascinating stuff. I'll look forward to it. if it ever ends up open source, I'll look forward to.
I think it will eventually, but it's just a question of when is right for them, since it's their work to decide when.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see how the market reacts to the self-referential, like non-pegged approach. But I think it's really like solid innovation there. It's like way better in my opinion, because you can always just denominate prices in whatever reference asset the user cares about. So you really only care about relative stability.
Yeah, I actually just tried to explain that in the Reflexer like research Discord. Somebody was asking questions, and I think people mostly got it. But it was really interesting because people are like, "Why are you denominating it in USD?" Like, well, that's what people want. But like, it's not really dependent on USD. It's just that people want to know what it's worth in USD, right? It exists entirely in this RAI ETH world, plus whatever numeraire you care to measure it in. But it turns out what numeraire you care to measure it in affects his decision making, and so it does sort of manifest properties related to whatever you're reporting it in, because it affects people's psychological perception and thus action. And thus, since the prices emerge from actions, in a sense, it's a UX problem that gets baked into the thing itself. So if we suddenly started reporting it in, BTC, then we might actually exhibit different behavior because people would be responding to its movements against BTC.
But I mean, like, you could in the front end or whatever for people managing their loans or or if people start using it for payments or whatever, the user can just define their preferred reference currency, right? Like if you're in China, you might want to use the Chinese yen or whatever it is.
Obviously, it's one of the front end, and it's super stripped down. But I totally agree with you that in the end, you'd want a front end where you just select your numeraire.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a really
interesting topic. I don't really like. I've got the screen up that Jeff's sharing. I don't have specific agenda here. I didn't do any Luna related work this week. Been busy with other stuff. But we could talk about, and I know we don't have Sean here. But we could talk about other things we could do. We could talk about other stuff. We could end early. I don't have any specific objective with this call today.
There's something, by the way, I have to tell you. Do you hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am just new around here and I'm just trying to understand what's going on. Like, I don't even have exact idea on what's happening with this modeling and like this Hue or Hive, how do we spell, what does it work for? I'm just trying to understand. So I'm not on the level to brainstorm just yet.
Sure, no worries. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if you're new to OneHive in general, wiki.onehive has a whole bunch of information kind of about what we're doing and like what's going on. It's very kind of chaotic because it's a decentralized community, and there's different community initiatives and different projects people are working on. This particular call is sort of a weekly call for the like Luna Swarm working group, and that's focused on token engineering and like modeling. We want to eventually use cadCAD to create like a computer-aided governance model that pulls in data from our applications on chain and combines it with like a model and gives us data to work with in terms of making protocol decisions and changing parameters and stuff. But
I know a bit. Of course, I've read all these, but like when you don't see something happening for real, like you see it with your own eyes, then until then you cannot be sure of what it is. Yes, yes, I see. Mm. Yeah, of course. Yes, that's, the idea of decentralizing stuff, it really excites me because I have searched about Bitcoin when it was just like starting to be known. So this is really something about the future and it really excites me a lot. So I would love to be in front. Thank you. Okay. Mm. Okay. 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 Thank you so much. Well, okay. I will just stay here try to understand you guys then. Thank you.
Have one other HoneySwap related modeling task that I guess could potentially be similar or distinct from this, which is we're doing this like sustainable farming thing, and we're going to have to figure out how to do allocation points for different pools, and with the sort of intention of attracting enough liquidity to reach some sort of like target for slippage. So this seems like a potentially interesting, almost computer-aided governance like input mechanism where we could be like, oh, how should we be setting our allocation points to attract enough liquidity in order to make swaps on specific pairs like more attractive based on what we're seeing on different chains or different pools.
Makes sense to me. And I think the main challenge is, as we discussed the first time, is sort of fleshing out the word problem, but it seems like a pretty well-defined one. Something where there's sort of the actual functions of the automated market makers give rise to liquidity, or give rise to slippages, and then you have some basic understanding of how much volume you want to be able to support, and thus how much liquidity you would need in order to keep the slippages relatively low. And kind of going back to the discussion we had, I think it was in one of the forums, if not in Discord, about HoneySwap as a whole, like the farms, realizing that if you spread the liquidity out too thin, then the allocation of this sort of fixed pool of capital spread across too many liquidity pools makes none of them very useful. So being able to not just like constrain the set itself, but then figure out, what's a good allocation. So if you have, so many, say, USD worth of liquidity to allocate or Ethereum worth of liquidity to allocate, that you can make sure that it's spread according to a distribution that is maybe roughly proportional to, say, the volumes you would expect on those pairs, because the higher the volumes, or in particular the higher the sort of individual trade sizes or sequences of trade sizes in the same direction, the more slippage you'll experience in practice. So it kind of works out to getting I guess sort of getting a handle on exactly what you're optimizing for, in this case, usefulness which is generally a function of slippage, and what allocation, what fixed resources or constrained resources you're allocating, in this case, liquidity. Sorry, that was a lot real fast, but I'm just kind of like mind dumping, if there's a sort of like implicit resource allocation problem of, it may be decentrally owned and managed, but it's still, the communal problem is, where do we put our liquidity such that the system is collectively useful, versus, say, where do we put such that the fees are maximized, and are those incentive aligned, etc. Where usefulness is, in this case, proxy for minimizing slippage, I would say. Like, maybe that's not the best proxy, but it's an example.
I mean, I think total fees is probably like a better proxy, because if people are paying the fees, they're getting, it's like a pretty clear proxy for value. But
yeah, I think the problem with total fees is that it doesn't balance stakeholders enough. So if you think about this in terms of two stakeholder groups, traders and liquidity providers, although many people are both, if you sort of partition those apart, there's obviously a flow of value in fees paid, but there's also the slippage metric gives you a sense of the utility to the traders, other than like essentially the thing that they're paying for, hopefully, is the service of liquidity, and thus they get a better service for the same price. If they do the same size trade and it slips less, they might pay the same amount but get more, right? So this idea that lower slippage is a better service quality, even if you're paying the same fees.
But if you're paying the same fees, and you're getting more, wouldn't you expect more volume and more fees? I guess.
Like, yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is that if we think
optimizing for low slippage in a pair that doesn't have all that much volume, it doesn't necessarily provide a lot of social utility, right?
Yeah. So what I'm not saying is optimize uniquely for low slippage or uniquely for fees. My point is you need both concepts, because there's at least two kinds of stakeholders, or like the problem doesn't reduce below two values. Because if you do just fees, then you can have lots of fees, lots of slippage, in which case the service quality is quote unquote low, but you've gotten a lot of fees.
Could we do something like related to utilization? So like if we have a metric of like, based on the liquidity depth and the amount of trade volume, you'll have higher utilization, I guess, which also would, I guess, imply relatively high slippage. And we would want to increase liquidity on those pairs because they're overutilized.
So it's a volume, right? So you're coming back to looking at the relationship between liquidity and the volume of trades, because high volume pool pairs need lots of liquidity to sort of wash out the and make sure that the price doesn't move too much. And remember that because of impermanent loss, a liquidity provider also wants low slippage. Like, low slippage means the price hasn't changed much, means less impermanent loss for the same sequence of trade sizes, right? So if they wash out perfectly and you get back exactly where you started, then the liquidity provider is happy and they have minimized their impermanent loss. They're like doing this basically volatility farming, because it's the movements without going anywhere. that are maximally profitable for liquidity providers. And what I would argue is that actually traders as well don't want slippage. They just want to switch the tokens for as close to the spot price as possible. And the more liquid it is, the more they can do that. So we can think about slippage as a sort of service quality metric, but that like fees are sort of a better characterization of them. Like there's a sort of throughput in the cumulative fees, but then there's a sort of like balance that comes from not slipping. So in some ways, I like to characterize like Uniswap instances as having sort of a changes in magnitude and direction. Like price changes are changes in direction, and quantities of liquidity like add removes or changes in magnitude, and you need enough magnitude to limit the changes in direction. You want it to not move much in direction, but you don't need infinite liquidity. You just need enough to mute the volatility. If you have enough to mute the volatility, then you're doing your job. Like I generally think of it as being ideally enough liquidity that the slippage is an order of magnitude or two below the transaction sizes. So if people are swapping and the price is moving like 1% or less, then it's probably fine. But if you don't have enough liquidity that with high expectation, any individual trade or like just sort of the high end side of size of the trade still moving only about 1%, then or causing only about 1% slippage, then you get bigger aggregate price moves, which means you get more impermanent loss, and you get sort of a quote unquote lower quality of service for the traders, which is part of the reason why you see trading activity accumulating around the highest liquidity pools, because they become competitive and people only want to do one transaction because gas is high, so they go use Uniswap v2 because the gas they get the best bang for their buck because the liquidity is so high, not because the protocol is actually better.
Right.
Anyway, sorry, I know I spent a lot of time working on AMMs, so I maybe have like too much going on in my head to express it all at once verbally. But I think you're going in the right direction. It's just more a question of teasing out specifically which problem you're trying to solve, because then you can solve it. But when you frame the problem, you also kind of determine the solution, even if you haven't found it yet. Like when you decide how to ask the question, the solution will be inherited from how you ask the question. Yeah, I mean, that's just science in a nutshell. But in this case, there's probably a nearly deterministic solution, for possibly even a completely deterministic solution to the question you ask about how to allocate resources in AMMs. The problem is that the question itself was subjective. So it's not really a deterministic answer, because it's only deterministic conditioned on how you frame the question. So it merits the most of the work going into what is it that you're really trying to accomplish, and how do you want to frame it. Once you have, you'll largely be able to derive an optimal policy for allocating capital across a pool or a portfolio of AMMs.
Makes sense. And I think it'll be really useful in addressing this question of, if we're doing this sustainable farming thing where we have basically rewards subsidizing liquidity on pools, how we allocate resources between those pools using allocation points. So it'll give us like a framework for making those decisions.
It's like having a balancer pool of Uniswap pools to try to rebalance.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a balancer pool, I don't think. It's just sort of like subsidies. Where do you put the subsidy at?
Well, no. So what I mean, and this is what I was actually, one of the things that I was talking to Marcus about, was if you use like a balancer-like logic where you pool the tokens, which were the LP tokens from the Uniswap pools, then what will happen is you will have incentives to rebalance conditioned on the yields of those tokens. So like the fees. So if you're generating a lot of fees, so you got to on one particular, or if the yields on Uniswap pair A and the yields on Uniswap pairs B and C are sort of different, then if you have LP tokens from the Uniswap pairs in a balancer pool, then that balancer pool's LP tokens are claims on LP tokens, which are claims on Uniswap pools. But you create the incentives to rebalance based on the yields from the individual pools.
Interesting. Yeah, that is an interesting mechanism.
It's just like It's a
Pretty
derivative.
meta.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, Marcus and I were brainstorming about it as something that a fund manager might want. That like if you as you get towards a point where like DeFi matures further and you have less people playing, gambling games 24/7 and basically playing with their money, seems like the case a lot of the time. And more like, I don't want to say passive, but sort of you get some of the passive benefits of active rebalancing by saying like, look, I want exposure not to underlying assets that are just maturing or sort of their value is appreciating or depreciating. Instead, I want exposure to assets which themselves sort of generate, so they have yield. So the it's like having a balancer pool of bonds, right? Like the underlying thing is also generating, or in this case, yielding. So you're like, okay,
Makes
but
sense.
how do you want to hold your position? Well, do you want to sell some of one for the other? Like you end up with this, again, like what's the demand for the things? Higher demand for the things that yield more. So then people might come in and swap the lower yield ones for the higher yield ones, rebalancing your position. But if you're taking fees, then you're accumulating fees in LP tokens. It's really just, it's a double stack AMM.
Yeah.
But it gives you a single access point where you're holding the LP token of the pool of LP tokens, so you can watch the yield of your meta token instead of watching the yield of a bunch of individual yielding tokens.
With the balancer pool, as you're doing that process, do the weights change depending on the accumulation of fees of the underlying LP tokens?
We were talking about the fact that balancer pools do have the the smart pools have the mechanisms for changing the weights. So like you could, for example, periodically update the weights to match the cumulative sum of the fees. So like you rebalance the pool by changing the weights using essentially an outer update mechanism that just said, hey, well, we want to weight, I don't know, say we want to weight the things with the highest cumulative fees higher, then we would imagine doing iterative weight updates every some epoch based on the cumulative fees, either historically or just over the period. I mean, again, like it's brainstorming, right? You're talking about creating what I would call better aggregated DeFi instruments to limit the number of total transactions. Because what ends up happening if you roll up is that instead of having to do lots of individual transactions on individual contracts, you're trading your claims on the other things. So it starts to, I mean, admittedly, look a lot more like some traditional finance mechanisms where people stop trading the thing, they're trading claims on the things, or claims on claims on claims on the things. So you definitely have to be really careful about it. But the thing I like about AMMs is they all have very, very strong properties. So you can make pretty explicit claims about what your aggregates, what properties your aggregates actually have. You can write it down like deterministically, mathematically, what, again, not the exact trajectories, but the properties. But I'm a super math nerd, so that's totally up my alley, and that's shit that I think about. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, the other question we're going to have to figure out, and I'm not sure, and it relates to automated market makers, but it's kind of different flavor. So one of the plans that we have for Honey Swap with the chain like liquidity aggregation is to have a state channel based automated market maker, or I guess it's not fully automated in the sense that each router or participant in the channel would be running their own like pricing logic, and then routes would be published. But presumably the routers, because they want to kind of passively add liquidity and not just be like active market makers, could use basically similar logic for managing their inventory across chains.
Right. Well, that's cool. I'm
lots of things.
Yeah, exactly. Like kind of like that's neat. And I mean, I think that's maybe the biggest challenge here is that we always have so many things that we think are cool that the key is to pick on specific ones and
prioritize,
like highlight them, and have proposals, and work on them. And obviously, you know me, I'm here to serve more for like throw out ideas or help evaluate, do office hours, do some math, do some code, but like help. So until there's like a well posed, hey, we're interested in the following, let's have a hack session on it, I'm mostly just going to throw ideas around, and you get the gist of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm not sure exactly when it will happen, but I think working on at least one of these as like a word problem and forming it makes sense as next steps. I just know that like I'm in the process of moving to Portland, and I've taken on a bunch of stuff over the past couple of weeks in terms of just work that I probably won't have a lot of bandwidth for the next couple of weeks.
Gotcha. Yeah. Not unreasonable. I'm doing a little bit of...
I have a question. Well, are you guys engineers or like your actual jobs in life based on these? Because there are so many terms, and I am trying to get them, Yes. Yeah, I am just a psychologist, and I am like, what is happening? Okay, I will understand. I love this kind of logic and like future things and technology and like this kind of an engineering and like finding new stuff. So I really love all these. I believe that I can get it, but I just wanted to ask.
If,
I'm not. Yes.
I mean, if
A lot.
Block.Science could pop open as model, we don't have to go over anything new. But one of the cool things about it is that there are considerations about the sort of both the technical like engineering components, but also the psych components are there. Like we reason about how people will be react to or be influenced by things.
Yes.
We do a lot of modeling, and we know that we don't know what decisions people will make, but we often explore what would happen if people thought or did certain things. And so we try to maintain that understanding that there isn't necessarily an exact answer. Like we don't know exactly what people are going to do, but we can think about what they might do and what that might mean.
Or what could be the best in some kind of conditions.
Yeah. I mean,
I
not that
can
you
bring up the model really quick, but
even the blog post, I just you're here, we're talking about Luna, we kind of just finished a cycle and we're kind of thinking about where to go next. So just in the interest of inclusion, I would say like even just a 5-minute overview of what we did last could be nice. That's all I'm thinking.
Yes, I just have it on a new tab, so I'm just gonna check it after this conversation is over.
Yeah, let me pull up the proposal here.
If you have any other links or some kind of websites that you can recommend that I should check, because I have one YouTube video, for example. So you can just send me. I'm gonna check. I have time right now.
I'll just take like a couple minutes and kind of walk through what we did for the last like modeling exercise on the honey supply policy. But if you're interested in the like token engineering cadCAD stuff, there's some really great YouTube videos with like resources that I think Sean's done in the like bootcamp stuff, and I think some of our past meetings have also been recorded, diving into some of the stuff. And just the general cadCAD website has, I think, a link to like getting started resources.
Okay.
But in the context of OneHive, and kind of the last Luna project, we had this kind of important decision to make with regard to the issuance policy for honey. So when we started and we migrated to XDAI, we'd sort of focused on conviction voting. We had this simple like issuance policy. Hold on, my laptop is about to die. There we go, saved it. So we had this this problem where we had like a simple issuance policy. It was just like we would set it via like voting to a different value, but it was always just every block issuing new honey into the common pool. And what we wanted to do instead was kind of create an automated policy that would dynamically adjust issuance in order to sort of minimize issuance when we didn't need it, and have it automatically ramp up depending on how people interacted with the system. So we wanted essentially these two goals. We wanted to make sure that the conviction voting like subsystem was able to consistently allocate honey to proposals. So there's always sort of funds available in the common pool. But we also wanted to make sure that honey remains scarce and increases in value over time. And with the like flat issuance policy, it was always issuing money. It was always like distributing money. So we kind of solved the first problem, but we didn't really solve the second problem. And there wasn't really a direct feedback loop between people choosing to not spend resources or to spend resources on things that created net inflows into the system. So what we did was created like a simplified model of kind of the mechanics of honey issuance and distribution. And we also created some like assumptions about the economic forces that might be acting on that mechanism. So like we simulated like possible relationship between price and productivity of proposals, creating inflows. And we came up with a kind of policy for adapting the supply based on a target reserve ratio. And even though this is just a total like simulation with a bunch of assumptions, we didn't pull in a lot of like on-chain data. We could over time supplement the model with actual data that we pull from activity as people interact with the protocol and pass more proposals. But it was able to kind of give us a framework for making the decision about like what policy we wanted to choose, and also what the specific parameters of that policy should be. So what the kind of target reserve rate was, and how that interacted with other parameters. So this proposal on the forum kind of walks through the reasoning behind it and some of the assumptions, and it links to the cadCAD model that we created if you wanted to kind of explore that as well. But it also sort of summarizes the process.
Yes, I understand. Well, that's a great idea. Like when something doesn't happen, your brain find a solution for that. Like even if it's so hard, it's the basis of everything that you can solve.
So it was a really really fun learning experience.
Yeah, sounds so. Thank you so much. Well, I guess I understand a bit now.
Yeah, I dropped a link to that. It's in the forum if you wanted to take a closer look.
I will. What does this table means? Like I am trying to understand, but I don't get it. I cannot exactly read.
So it's a little bit hard to read the whole thing, but in the simulation, we ran through like 120 time steps, with each time step representing kind of a month of simulated time. And this graph shows the total supply, the amount of supply that's in circulation, and the amount of supply in the reserve. So the blue line's like the total supply, the orange is the circulating supply, and the green is the reserve. And the model runs through different parameters. So like it's showing multiple runs of the simulation using different values for one of the parameters, in this case, the throttle, at different values.
Yes.
And even with the same values, it also runs multiple times with different random seeds. So you get like what's called a Monte Carlo analysis of that run. So it simulates not just like one time through, But I think in this case, we were doing 10 Monte Carlo runs per time. So that's why this chart looks kind of fuzzy, because you're seeing a trend in terms of multiple runs, kind of showing the lines, but you also see how like there's like faint, more transparent blue lines. That would be like an individual instance. So you're seeing like the overall trend in the sensitivity and the variability, as well as just the actual results. So when you go through these things, you can see that some of the throttle is less sensitive to changes than, say, the target reserve ratio, where you like have a pretty clear, consistent trend here, and a more consistent trend here, and lots of variability depending on what you set this value to. And being able to look through that process, even though we're building this all on assumptions, allowed us to kind of decide that like maybe we can have the throttle, which is less sensitive, be lower and set more based on like what we want. And we want to have the reserve as something we might adjust a little bit over time, based on our observation of like additional data. But like it would be a pretty reasonable place to start based on our analysis.
I see. Well, that sounds really amazing. Like working on an assumption and you have these tables, like that's how we improve ourselves. That's how we do something in life and also something in that kind of a business. I really loved it a lot.
Thank you.
Really great job. Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for all these information. So I'm just gonna go and check the links, and like, may I ask questions if I have? Probably I will.
There's the Luna channel here. If you under the bees section, there's a channel called Luna, and it's for this sort of working group. And so if you have any questions on the model or cadCAD in general, that's a good place to ask.
Okay.
There's also like a token engineering like cross-pollination channel, and like a whole rabbit hole around cadCAD and token engineering, beyond just the Luna swarm. So if you get interested in this stuff, you can also share additional resources, and stuff for learning as well.
Okay, I see. Well, thank you. And well, I'm not sure if I'm gonna go that much through for engineering, but for sure I'm interested. And this really sounds so amazing. At least I want to know what you do to admire. Like,
Awesome.
I'm just discovering. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'd
yeah.
also say, though, that this particular group is not meant to be purely engineering, because so much of the decision making and like goal setting and problem framing is subjective, that at least for my part, the emphasis is always on engineering conditioned on good problem formulation, and good problem formulation is not naturally an engineering only task. You need
Of course.
people involved who have other expertises.
Yes, I agree with you about that. I'm just discovering, and it seems like it's gonna be a great adventure. Really, thank you so much for being this much warm. So I'm just gonna leave right now. If there is nothing you would like to say.
I think I'm gonna hop off as well.
I didn't hear.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So thank you so much. See you guys later.
Take care.
Bye bye. Yeah,
Bye.
I gotta roll too, guys. I'll see ya.
See you.